She thought it was just another night, just another hotel room where she could finally rest. But when the door opened, her heart froze. The room had been double booked, and standing there was a black man, tired, polite, carrying the weight of a world that rarely welcomed him. The manager's careless mistake forced them into a situation neither expected. Fear, prejudice, and safety collided in a single room, and when he whispered, "You take the bed. I'll stay awake and keep you safe," she realized the danger wasn't him. It was everything she had been taught to believe. But what happened that night would change her life forever. She had always believed that the hardest part of leaving home would be saying goodbye. Yet as the bus rumbled past the edge of her small town, she realized the real challenge wasn't departure. It was everything that came after. Her hometown was the kind of place where the world seemed to stand still. Streets curled around each other in quiet loops, lined with cracked sidewalks and front porches where the same families had lived for generations. Everyone knew each other's business, but they also knew each other's names, faces, and stories. She grew up under the protective gaze of neighbors who waved from rocking chairs, teachers who remembered her parents, and friends who rarely strayed more than a few miles from where they were born. But she was different. She carried an ache for more. Her family loved her, and they encouraged her to dream, but there was always an invisible wall around their world, safe, familiar, but small. She wanted independence. She wanted to step into the unknown, to test her strength in places where no one could rescue her if she stumbled. That longing burned in her chest every time she packed her bag for school, every time she stayed awake at night scrolling through pictures of distant cities and stories of people who had carved their own path. Her parents had hugged her tightly before she left, pretending their pride wasn't mixed with worry. "Call us every night," her mother had said, voice trembling beneath a smile. Her father had patted her shoulder, silent in his own way, but his eyes had given him away. They trusted her, but they also knew the world wasn't always kind, especially to young women traveling alone. She promised them she'd be safe, though deep down, even she wasn't sure what that meant. The journey stretched long. Hours blurred as highways unwound before her, painted in gray and dotted with gas stations that smelled of coffee and gasoline. She filled the silence with thoughts of her future, the career she hoped to build, the people she wanted to meet, the kind of life she wanted to claim for herself. But behind every bright thought was a shadow of doubt. Would the world accept her? Would they see her worth, or dismiss her the moment she walked into a room? She had felt the sting of judgment before, subtle and sharp. A teacher who assumed she wouldn't understand advanced material. A shop clerk who followed her a little too closely through the aisles. Strangers who sized her up, making her feel as if she needed to justify her presence. These moments never erupted into open hostility, but they left behind a residue. A quiet reminder that prejudice didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered. And sometimes whispers were worse, because you started to question if it was all in your head. By the time she pulled into the city where she planned to stay for the night, exhaustion clung to her like a heavy coat. The hotel appeared like a beacon, a low-rise building with glowing windows and a modest sign promising rest. She wasn't looking for luxury. She wanted safety. A door that locked, a bed to collapse into, and the assurance that she could start, fresh in the morning. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale air, though the overhead lights gave it a polished glow. A clerk sat behind the desk, his expression practiced but cold. When she approached, his eyes flicked briefly to her clothes, her tired posture, and her ID. She noticed the pause, long enough to sting but not long enough for him to be called out on it. She told herself not to care. She told herself it didn't matter, but it did. Every time. He tapped on the computer, handed her a key card, and spoke with the clipped tone of someone who had done this 1,000 times before but hadn't yet learned the art of kindness. She wanted to ask a dozen questions about breakfast, about checkout times, about safety, but his indifference left her silent. She took the card, nodded politely, and walked away, pretending she hadn't felt small under his gaze. Her suitcase, wheels rattled against the carpeted hallway as she searched for her room. The corridor stretched long and quiet, lined with closed doors and dim wall lamps that cast more shadows than light. Every step echoed, and the silence pressed close, heavy and suffocating. She felt exposed, as though unseen eyes were watching from behind the doors. It was probably nothing, but the unease grew with every step. She reached the door, slid the card, and exhaled when the green light blinked. Inside, she imagined warmth, privacy, and a chance to shed the weight of the road. She wasn't prepared for the surprise that waited beyond that door. The figure already inside, equally tired, equally human, and yet destined to change the course of her night, her trust, and perhaps even her life. At this point, she still believed safety was about locks, about walls, about closing herself off from the unknown. She didn't yet understand that safety could also mean vulnerability, that sometimes the person you feared could become the person who protected you. The night was still young, but the story had already begun to shift, and soon she would come, face to face with everything she thought she knew about prejudice, danger, and the lies we're told about who deserves to be trusted. The door opened with a soft click, and she stepped inside, expecting quiet, comfort, and the relief of finally being alone. But her body froze the moment her eyes adjusted to the dim light. There was someone already there. A man. He sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders heavy with exhaustion, his dark skin illuminated by the glow of a muted television. His expression mirrored hers, confusion, disbelief, and the sharp jolt of being caught in a place neither expected the other to be. For a long, unbearable second, they just stared at each other. Her hand tightened around the key card. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an identical one. The same number was stamped on it, the same claim to the space. A mistake. That's all it had to be. A clerical error, a double booking. It should have been simple to fix. But even as reason whispered this truth, something else crawled up her spine. Not fear of him, not really, but fear of what she had been conditioned to believe. That men like him were dangerous, that proximity to him could be unsafe. The stereotypes she'd heard all her life began to hum in her ears, drowning out logic, pulling her deeper into unease. Before either could break the silence, a sharp knock rattled the door. The voice of the front desk clerk followed, clipped and impatient. "Both of you, come downstairs. Now." The lobby's fluorescent lights buzzed above them, exposing every flaw, every tension, every glance from strangers who paused to watch. The clerk stood behind the desk, arms crossed, irritation painted on his face. He didn't bother with apologies. He didn't admit fault. Instead, his voice was flat, dismissive. "We're fully booked," he said, as though announcing the weather. "One of you will have to leave." His eyes locked onto the man. "You." The words sliced through the air, not even a question. A command. The man inhaled slowly, his chest rising with the effort of restraint. Calmly, he presented his confirmation email, his receipts, and proof that he had reserved the room in advance. He explained clearly that he had the same rights as any other guest. But the clerk barely glanced at the papers. His lip curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like disdain. "Policy," he muttered, waving a hand as if the details didn't matter. It wasn't about policy, it was about prejudice. She could feel it in the way the clerk's eyes lingered, in the way other guests shifted uncomfortably nearby, pretending not to watch but drinking in the scene. His presence was an inconvenience, his proof irrelevant, because his skin was enough to strip him of credibility. She should have spoken then. should have stepped forward, named the injustice for what it was. But fear wrapped around her throat, like a rope. Fear of conflict, fear of drawing attention, fear of admitting out loud what everyone else was already thinking. So, she stayed silent, guilt curling deep in her stomach, while he absorbed the humiliation that should never have been his burden to carry. When the clerk finally relented, it wasn't with fairness, but with mockery. "Fine," he said, the word dripping with indifference. "Figure it out yourselves." Dismissed. Like children fighting over scraps, like they weren't worth more than the inconvenience they caused. Back in the room, the air was thick with everything unsaid. She sat, her bag down, her body buzzing with restless guilt. He sat quietly, his expression unreadable, his dignity intact, even as the weight of the evening pressed on him. "I can take the floor," she whispered, almost ashamed of the words as they left her mouth. He shook his head. His voice was low, steady, an anchor against the storm. "No, you take the bed. I'll stay awake. Make sure nothing happens." The words struck her harder than any insult could have. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting her. In a world that painted him as the danger, he was choosing to be her shield. The night stretched endlessly. Shadows crawled across the walls, creeping longer as hours passed. She lay beneath the covers, her eyes heavy but her mind restless. She could hear him shifting in the chair, never fully at ease, his breathing steady but laced with tension. Every sound in the hallway made her jolt, the slam of a door, the hum of the elevator, footsteps dragging against carpet. Each noise carried the possibility of intrusion, of confrontation. Sleep was impossible. Fear hovered just beyond the locked door. Then came the voices. Loud, drunken, careless. A group of men stumbled down the hall, their laughter jagged, their footsteps unsteady. They stopped outside the door. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "This is the room," one slurred, followed by a chorus of crude laughter. Knuckles pounded against the wood, hard enough to rattle the frame. She froze, every muscle locked. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. But he rose, quietly, slowly, placing himself between her and the door, his frame blocking the handle. "Stay still," he whispered, calm but firm. The pounding grew louder. Insults spilled through the crack in the door, venomous and mocking, aimed at whoever dared to answer. The words weren't just drunk nonsense. They carried something darker, something dangerous. Her chest burned with the weight of terror. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came. She realized then the brutal truth. The only barrier between her and those men was him, the one she had been told to fear. Minutes felt like hours. The voices lingered, taunting, until finally they staggered away, swallowed by the silence of the hallway. Her hands trembled. She turned her head and saw him still standing at the door, steady, unshaken, carrying the weight of a protector who had been forced into that role far too many times before. Dawn crept through the blinds, pale and unwelcome. Exhaustion clung to her bones, but she hadn't truly slept. Neither had he. Yet when she gathered the courage to march to the front desk, determined to demand justice, she was met with something far worse than indifference. Whispers. They followed, her like shadows. Guests lingering in the lounge glanced up, eyes narrowing, lips curling. She caught fragments of their murmurs. Shared a room with him. What was she thinking? Dangerous. The story had twisted overnight. The narrative had already been written. Not about a hotel's mistake, not about the clerk's prejudice, not about drunken men pounding at their door. No, the blame fell on her decision not to run, not to fear him enough. When she reached the desk, the clerk's smirk was waiting, smug and cruel. His words dripped with false politeness. Was everything comfortable? The question wasn't about comfort. It was about shame. Her throat tightened. For a moment, silence tempted her again. But the weight of the night, of his steady presence, of her own cowardice, pushed her forward. "No," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "It wasn't comfortable. Your mistake could have put me in danger. You disrespected him, and you disrespected me, and you owe us both more than this mockery." The smirk faltered, just for a moment. But the room around her felt colder, the stares sharper, heavier. And then she saw him. Standing quietly beside her, he carried himself with the same calm dignity he had shown all night. But his eyes told the truth. A storm raged behind them, the quiet fury of a man who had lived this story too many times before. She realized then that this wasn't just about one night. It wasn't about a room, or a clerk, or drunken men in the hall. It was about centuries of prejudice condensed into a single mistake. It was about a system designed to humiliate, to silence, to remind him, and people like him, that they didn't belong. And as they stepped out of the lobby into the cool morning air, she knew the night had changed her, because she finally understood. The real danger wasn't the man she had been taught to fear. The real danger was the world that insisted she should. And beyond the hotel doors, that world was waiting. The sunlight that morning was supposed to mean freedom, a clean slate, a fresh start after a restless night filled with shadows and whispers. But instead, as she pushed open the glass doors of the hotel, suitcase dragging behind her, the air outside felt heavy, charged, like a storm waiting to break. The world had not forgotten what had happened, and the world was not about to let them leave quietly. The parking lot was a stage, and they had been cast in a role neither of them chose. Two men stood leaning against a car near the edge of the lot, their faces too familiar. She recognized them instantly, the same men whose fists had hammered the hotel door in the dark hours of night, whose drunken voices had thrown poison through the cracks in the wood. Their eyes lit up at the sight of her. But more importantly, at the sight of him walking beside her. Their smirks spread like fire, fueled by the cruelty that had simmered all night long. "Well, well, well," one of them jeered, loud enough that heads turned from the lobby doors behind them. "Look who survived the night! Princess here and her bodyguard." The word dripped with venom, designed to sting. A small cluster of guests stopped to watch. A mother tugged her child closer, shielding little ears from the tone but not the meaning. A man carrying a briefcase slowed his steps, pretending to check his phone while his gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. Strangers became spectators. Their silence became complicity. The second man let out a laugh, a sound sharp enough to cut. "Bet it was cozy, huh? One bed, two people. Can't say I blame him. Always knew guys like that couldn't resist the chance." She felt the words pierce her chest before she even registered them fully. They weren't just insults. They were accusations, filthy, degrading lies dipped in centuries of racist stereotypes. In that instant, she understood that this wasn't about her. Not really. This was about him. About every black man who had ever been painted as dangerous simply for existing near someone like her. The insult wasn't only meant to humiliate. It was meant to criminalize, to cast suspicion, to transform dignity into threat. Her breath caught. Her body screamed to step back, to fade into the background, to avoid becoming a target. Fear had a voice, and it hissed in her ear. "Stay quiet. Don't make this worse. Keep your head down." But guilt had a louder voice. Now, the guilt of silence in the lobby when the clerk had dismissed him without a second thought. The guilt of lying still in bed while he guarded the door against drunken fists. The guilt of benefiting from a world that assumed she was innocent. While assuming he was guilty, she opened her mouth, But before she could form words, one of the men shoved forward. His shoulder collided with the man's chest, a deliberate, forceful move meant to provoke. The sound of impact cracked through the air like thunder. He staggered only slightly but held his ground. His jaw tightened, his fists curled at his sides. But he didn't strike back. His silence wasn't a weakness. It was control, control that must have cost him everything. The crowd collectively inhaled, waiting for him to explode, waiting for him to prove the stereotype right, waiting for violence to justify their prejudice. But instead, he spoke. His voice was steady, sharp as steel. It cut through the thick air, silencing even the men who had mocked him. You think you're strong because you have a crowd, because you have a system that tells you you'll always be right, and I'll always be wrong. But you're not strong. You're cowards, hiding behind slurs, hiding behind history that was built on lies. You want me to break, to give you the excuse you're begging for, but I won't give you that. Not today, not ever. Every syllable carried weight, not just his own pain, but the pain of generations before him. Centuries of humiliation, chains, whispers, and walls seemed to echo in the sound of his defiance. He wasn't just defending himself, he was speaking for every man forced into silence, for every life warped by prejudice, for every moment when dignity had been stripped away without reason. The two men faltered, their sneers cracking into unease. But arrogance is a stubborn poison. One of them spat at his feet, a final act of degradation, an attempt to reclaim power. The glob of spit glistened on the pavement, and the crowd's silence deepened. Something inside her snapped. All the years of quiet compliance, all the unspoken agreement with a society that told her his life was worth less than hers, all the comfort of looking away, it shattered in that single moment. She couldn't stand behind him anymore, cloaked in silence. She had to step forward. Her voice trembled, but it was sharp enough to slice through the parking lot. Enough! The word ricocheted off car doors, off glass windows, off the hearts of everyone present. Dozens of eyes turned to her, waiting to see if she would retreat into whispers or rise into truth. You humiliated him, she continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. You mocked him, treated him like less than human. And all of you, she gestured to the bystanders, their faces pale in the morning light. You watched, you let it happen. But last night, when I was in danger, he was the one who kept me safe, not you, not the staff, not the cowards pounding at the door. Him. A gasp rippled through the small crowd. A few looked down at the ground, ashamed. Others stiffened, defensive, unwilling to acknowledge the mirror she was holding up. The men by the car shifted uncomfortably, their confidence cracking under the weight of her words. If you can't see that the only danger here is in your hate, then you're blinder than I thought, she finished, her chest heaving, her hands shaking but steady enough to hold the line. The silence that followed was heavier than the insults had been. One of the men muttered a curse under his breath, but the fight had drained from him. They exchanged a glance, then turned and climbed into their car, slamming doors hard enough to make the onlookers flinch. Tires screeched as they sped away, leaving only exhaust and shame in their wake, but the damage was already done. The crowd had seen. The whispers would grow, the story would twist again, but this time she had left her mark on it. This time, silence had not won. He turned to her slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was no smile, no outward sign of victory. But in the depths of his gaze, she saw something more powerful, recognition, not gratitude, because he had never needed saving, but acknowledgement that finally she had chosen to stand beside him rather than behind him. Her heart pounded. Her hands still trembled, but for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of truth settle in her chest, heavy and unshakable. The world hadn't changed. The prejudice hadn't vanished. The fight was far from over. But something inside her had shifted forever, and as they walked away from the silent crowd, the hotel shrinking behind them, she knew this was only the beginning. Because when a single night can strip away centuries of lies, the echoes of it are unstoppable, and the world was about to hear those echoes. The glass doors of the hotel slid shut behind them, but the echoes of what had happened inside clung to the air around them like smoke. From the outside, the building looked ordinary. Tourists dragging bags, clerks moving papers, the faint buzz of conversation in the lobby. But for them, it was no longer just a hotel. It was a stage where silence had been broken, where cruelty had been exposed, where truths too long ignored had been forced into the open. They walked across the dim parking lot in silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because words would have collapsed under the weight of what they carried. Each step felt like leaving behind one version of themselves and stepping into another. For her, the memory looped endlessly. The insults spat into the air, the laughter of men who felt untouchable, the clerk's hollow eyes that saw a problem. Instead of a person, the crowd that watched but did nothing. But most of all, her own silence. The way she froze for too long before her voice finally broke through. For him, the scene was painfully familiar. He had lived versions of it before. Different faces, different settings, the same story repeating itself. He carried it with a quiet, practiced strength, but also with an exhaustion that no one else could feel. Survival had become second nature. But dignity had to be fought for over and over, each day a new battlefield. By the next morning, the story was already spreading. Guests who had witnessed the confrontation whispered in hallways. Someone had recorded parts of it on a phone. Within days, the clip was online. Grainy footage, shaky hands, muffled voices, but the emotions were clear. People saw the clerk brushing him aside, saw the men circling like predators, heard the venom in their words. And then came the turning point, her trembling voice rising. Against them, refusing to stay silent, refusing to let cruelty pass unchecked. The video split viewers in half. Some dismissed it as an overreaction, just another late-night incident at a hotel. Others attacked him, twisting stereotypes into excuses. But far more people saw something else, something undeniable. They saw a man who had done nothing but exist, treated as if his presence was a threat. They saw a woman confronting not only strangers, but everything she had once believed about the world. What began as a rumor turned into a debate. What turned into a debate became headlines, and the hotel, desperate to control the fire, released a polished apology. We regret the incident. We are committed to diversity. We will review our policies. But no press release could erase what had been seen. For her, the fallout was brutal. Friends asked why she hadn't spoken sooner. Strangers praised her courage, while others accused her of exaggeration. But none of it mattered compared to the storm inside her. She had always believed racism was history, something written in textbooks, something that existed in other places, far away. But now she knew the truth. It lived in the present, in the clerk's cold eyes, in the laughter of men who knew no one would stop them, in the silence of the crowd. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Her guilt was sharp. She remembered the seconds she stayed quiet in the lobby, the way her chest tightened, the fear that stopped her tongue. She replayed it until the memory became unbearable, but instead of crushing her, it reshaped her. She began to speak. To friends who looked away when jokes were made, to co-workers who dismissed stories of bias as exaggeration, to the family who told her she was overthinking things. She told them not only what happened in the hotel, but what it revealed. That racism wasn't only in slurs or violence, it was in silence, in hesitation, in the comfort of pretending nothing was wrong. She confessed her own silence. And by naming it, she stripped it of power. He did not speak as often. He didn't owe the world his pain, didn't owe anyone an explanation. But when he chose to share, his words carried the weight of centuries. "I didn't need her to save me," he told one reporter, his voice steady. "But she needed to save the truth. That's the difference." He spoke of the exhaustion of carrying dignity in a world determined to strip it away, of how survival itself was an act of resistance, of how he had learned to walk into rooms knowing eyes would follow, waiting for him to falter, and yet how he refused to bend. For some, his calmness was uncomfortable. They expected rage. They expected tears. But he gave them something harder to dismiss: the unshakable strength of a man who had endured too much to be broken by one night. As the story grew, so did the reactions. Some in the community rallied, organizing vigils, demanding accountability. From the hotel, speaking openly about the prejudice they too had faced. For the first time, many found their voices, but others doubled down on hate. Online threads filled with venom, anonymous messages whispered threats. Strangers muttered as he walked past, as if reminding him that the fight was far from over. And then there were the silent ones, the neighbors, co-workers, classmates, who smiled in passing but avoided the subject entirely. Silence was easier, safer, but silence, as he knew, was also complicity. The lasting change time passed. The headlines faded, as they always do. But for them, life had been permanently rewritten. She no longer moved through the world the same way. Every sideways glance, every dismissive comment, every unspoken prejudice leapt out at her now. She saw it where she once saw nothing. She heard it in voices she once trusted. She felt it in rooms where she once believed she belonged. It was painful, disorienting, but necessary. Because change, she realized, begins with discomfort. For him, the night was not a transformation, but confirmation. He had long known what the world was capable of. But now, he carried something new, proof that silence could be broken, even by someone who once stood on the other side of it. Proof that hearts and minds could shift. Not all, not quickly, but some. And sometimes, some was enough to start. Years later, when children asked about the video, they told the story carefully, not as a tale of victimhood, but of awakening. He told them about dignity, that it is not given by the world, but claimed fiercely and repeatedly. She told them about silence, that it is the greatest ally of hate and the hardest habit to break. Together, they told them about courage, that it doesn't always roar. Sometimes it trembles, sometimes it stumbles, but still it speaks. And their children carried that story forward, not as shame, but as a compass. A reminder that even in ordinary places, a hotel, a lobby, a parking lot, the fight for justice can ignite. The world did not become kinder overnight. Strangers still stared. Whispers still followed. Prejudice still lingered in both shadows and daylight. But something had begun. A seed planted in the cracks of injustice, watered by defiance, fed by courage. The hotel would one day be renovated, repainted and renamed. Guests would come and go without ever knowing what had happened there. But for those who remembered, the building was more than bricks and glass. It was proof. Proof that racism thrives in silence. Proof that silences, once broken, cannot be restored. Proof that one night, one voice, one act of courage can ripple far beyond its moment. And so the story ends, not with a neat resolution, but with a challenge. Because the real question is not what happened to them. The real question is, what will happen when it happens again? When the next insult is hurled, when the next injustice unfolds, when the next crowd stands frozen, watching, will you look away or will you speak? Short story. Conclusion. That night at the hotel was more than a mistake in booking. It was a mirror. A mirror that showed how fragile silence can be, how cruel prejudice remains, and how courage often begins in the smallest of voices. She walked in, believing safety came from fear. She left knowing safety comes from truth. He walked in carrying the weight of generations. He left carrying proof that silence can be shattered, even by someone who once stood apart. And together, they proved something simple yet unforgettable. Racism thrives when we look away. But when even one person dares to speak, the silence breaks, and nothing is ever the same again.